There's a kind of loneliness that settles in after 50, not the kind that comes from a quiet house or an empty chair at the dinner table, though those cut deep too. No, this kind lingers in the bones slow and steady like winter creeping into a woman's joints. It's the ache of being overlooked, dismissed, forgotten. Margaret didn't think she was asking for too much. A roof, a little warmth, someone to look her in the eyes and not see a burden. But in a world where mail-order brides were chosen for soft curves, strong hips, and the promise of sons, Margaret, with her thinning hair and a cough that never quite left, was deemed too sickly, too weak for a man's house, too worn to build a life with. They said no one would want her. They were wrong. Somewhere along the Colorado frontier, in a town the train barely stopped for, there lived a widowed pharmacist with calloused hands and tired eyes who understood that some wounds don't show up on skin. He didn't just mix powders and potions. He'd lost before, and he could see things others didn't. So when a pale woman with trembling fingers stepped off the stagecoach, clutching her coat like armor and looking for a name that hadn't written her back, he didn't send her away. He invited her in. This isn't a story about healing just a body. It's about healing a heart long abandoned, about a woman the world gave up on, and a man who looked past the fading and saw the fire still burning underneath. If you've ever felt left behind or know someone who has, you might want to stay a while, because sometimes the cure we need isn't found in a bottle. It's found in someone who chooses to stay. They told her she was too fragile for this world, too pale, too tired, too quiet, too much of a burden, too sickly to be a bride, too broken to be chosen. At 52, Miriam Grace Langley had grown used to the sound of doors closing. First, it had been the man her parents arranged for her to marry in her 20s, who turned away the moment he learned she had fainting spells and difficulty breathing in high altitude. Then came the whispers in church pews that the Langley girl couldn't carry children, that she was always on the edge of illness, that even her laugh sounded tired. In time, she stopped laughing. She lived alone in a small room above the dry goods store in Silsbee, Texas, taking in mending and bookkeeping for shopkeepers who didn't know what else to do with her. Life had narrowed down to stitched seams, cold tea, and prayers that faded somewhere between heaven and dust. One Sunday afternoon, a mail-order bride notice arrived. It was meant for someone younger, surely, but Miriam read it anyway, tracing the faded ink with a careful finger. Widower seeks companion. Must be God-fearing. Prefer someone quiet. Homestead in Winning Creek, Montana territory. Marriage arrangement preferred. Age not a concern. Age not a concern. Her heart stirred in a way it hadn't in years. Of course, when she arrived in Winding Creek weeks later, after coughing her way through 2 train rides and a frostbitten wagon journey, the cabin where she was to be received was empty. No fire in the hearth, no man waiting on the porch, just snow and silence, and a single note pinned to the doorframe. She looked too sick to survive the winter. I'll not be burdened. Find another ride back. Her knees gave out before her heart did. But the snow didn't catch her. A pair of rough-gloved hands did. You all right, ma'am? The voice was deep, steady. A man in a wool coat with a leather satchel slung across his shoulder. He looked more like a drifter than a doctor, but his hands were warm and his eyes didn't flinch at the sight of her. That was the day Miriam Grace fainted into the arms of Silas Boone, former Texas Ranger, now the only pharmacist within 50 miles of Winding Creek. She didn't know it yet, but the healing had already begun. They said she wouldn't survive the winter, but Silas saw something in her others didn't, something worth staying for. When Miriam awoke, it was not to the bitter howl of wind, but the low hiss of a kettle and the soft creak of a rocking chair. Her body ached, but there was warmth at her back, a quilt thick and patched smelling of cedar and something clean. She blinked slowly, her lashes heavy with sleep and the memory of shame. You're awake. The voice was gentle, a man's voice, familiar now. She turned her head and found him at the stove, Silas Boone. Not a man prone to smiling, but not hardened either. He had the kind of face time didn't apologize for, strong lines, a jaw like old oak, and eyes that had seen too much. And yet when they looked at her, there was no pity, just attention. She tried to sit up. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be any trouble. Silas poured tea into a chipped enamel mug and brought it to her. You're not trouble, ma'am. You're breathing. That's more than what most folks expected when they saw you fall like that. His words weren't cruel. They were matter of fact, like a man who'd long since learned to tell hard truths gently. He helped her sit, steadied her hands around the cup. Miriam sipped slowly. The tea was bitter with herbs, but laced with honey. It slid down her throat like something sacred. You were left, he said after a moment. Bride gone bad, I suppose. She nodded, too tired to be ashamed. Silas didn't say, I'm sorry, or that's awful. Instead, he said, that's not the first man to leave something behind on that hill, but you might be the first that didn't deserve it. Something in her chest loosened at those words. Not entirely, but just enough to draw a real breath. Over the next week, Miriam stayed in the back room of Silas Boone's apothecary. She learned quickly that it wasn't just a shop of tonics and tinctures, it was a lifeline for this forgotten town. Folks came in with frostbites, snake bites, coughing children, and broken hearts. Silas gave them what he could. She watched him work, quietly, gratefully. She folded linens and swept floors, mended his shirts without being asked. It wasn't about earning her keep, she just needed to move to feel useful again. One morning he handed her a bundle of dried lavender. For your chest and for your nerves. You seem to carry too much. Miriam hesitated. I've always been told I carry too little, that I can't hold up to a man's needs, he interrupted gently. Don't believe everything a man tells you, especially not the ones who run away. That was the first time she smiled, and he noticed. One evening as snow whispered against the windows, Silas sat beside her by the fire. He asked about her life not out of politeness, but real interest. She told him about her sewing her quiet days, the books she'd loved, the letters she used to write but never sent. He listened, all of him, like no one ever had. And when she told him about the bride, as she answered how she'd saved coin for months, how she traveled through pain and storms and disbelief, he looked at her as if she were made of iron, not glass. Anyone who thinks you're too weak, he said, hasn't looked close enough. She didn't know it yet, but something else was blooming that winter, not just in her lungs or her strength, but in the quiet space between his silence and her stories. He saw past her body into the woman she'd buried beneath years of shame. But could she let herself be seen without flinching? There's a peculiar ache that comes not from being hurt, but from being treated kindly after a lifetime of rejection. Miriam felt it every time Silas handed her a cup of tea or sat with her in silence, asking nothing in return. Kindness, after all, has weight, and for a woman like her, who'd only ever been labeled too sickly, too old, or too much trouble, it was heavier than most burdens she'd carried. She found herself folding into herself even as her strength returned. Her steps grew steadier, her cough loosened. She could lift the kettle without trembling now, but the fear of being seen, truly seen, remained. Silas had offered her a cot in the apothecary's back room until she was strong enough to decide what's next. But what came next? There was no fiancé to return to, no family who wanted her, no home but this strange snowblown town, and this silent man with hands roughened by healing. She offered to leave. I'm better now, she said one morning, her shawl clutched tight around her shoulders. I could try and find work. I don't want to overstay. You haven't, he said plainly, not even looking up from the ledger he was scribbling into. And you're not a burden. But I'm not, she began. Not what he said gently, eyes finally lifting to meet hers. Not what they hoped for when they saw your name in a letter. Not what they wanted when they imagined someone smaller, younger, prettier. She said nothing, lips trembling. Silas set his pencil down. What they missed, Miriam, was what you carried through that storm just to get here. You could have died trying, but you didn't. That matters. A long silence passed between them. Her breath hitched softly. But I'm still not easy, she whispered. No one worth anything ever is, he replied. And yet, despite his words, Miriam struggled to let herself belong. She moved about the apothecary each day, dusting shelves and labeling jars. When the townsfolk came, weathered ranchers, nervous young mothers, coughing children, she stayed out of the way, unsure of her place. But Silas slowly nudged her forward. Mrs. Abernathy needs help steeping this for her husband, he'd say, placing the packet in Miriam's hand. Or, you've a gentler touch for that tincture than I do. She did as asked, and over time something changed. People began to greet her by name. They began to linger. Some brought her scraps of cloth or buttons for mending. One child handed her a drawing, her and Silas standing behind the counter, and she stared at it longer than she meant to. But it wasn't all healing. One afternoon, two men came in, strangers passing through, their boots still coated in road mud. They looked at Miriam too long with that familiar twist of amusement and cruelty. "Mail order bride, are you?" one jeered. "Guess beggars can't be choosers out here." Miriam flushed, shrinking inside herself. The room tilted just slightly, but Silas stepped forward. "She's a woman," he said, voice even, "and she's my guest. So either show her respect or take your business elsewhere." The men laughed, mumbled something under their breath, and left. Silas didn't look at her, then just returned to stocking shelves. But the gesture echoed. Miriam stood there for a long moment, clutching the edge of the counter, her heart beating hard against her ribs. She was being defended. She was being chosen, not in romance, not yet, but in something quieter and just as rare. He had stood up for her. But could she stand up for herself and face the haunting voice that still whispered, "You're not enough"? Some wounds don't scream, they whisper. Miriam had carried them not in open pain, but in quiet avoidance, in the way she never met her own eyes in the mirror, or how she always sat with her back to the window so her reflection wouldn't catch in the glass. But now in Silas's apothecary, with every passing day of safety and stillness, those whispers began to rise louder, demanding to be answered. It was the morning after the strangers mocked her. Silas was out gathering herbs along the creek, and the shop was quiet save for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Miriam stood in front of the tiny mirror above the wash basin in the back room. The glass was smudged, dust-lined at the edges, but it reflected enough. She stared. What did they see? A woman of nearly 50 with worry lines that never left, hair that no longer held its deep chestnut tone, shoulders rounded not just by age but by years of trying to disappear. She had been called sickly, plain unfit, and more often than not too much trouble for what little she offered. Not just by the man who'd rejected her mail-order promise, but by others. A father who saw her as a burden once her mother died. A brief husband who abandoned her when she couldn't bear children. A world that treated a woman's worth like perishable fruit, only good when sweet, young, and fresh. She'd believe them. That was the quiet shame of it all. Until Silas. He hadn't spoken promises or poetry. He hadn't touched her hand or praised her face. But his every action had said something even harder to believe. You deserve to be here. Miriam touched the glass. Her hand shook slightly. You're not the words they gave you, she whispered aloud. The mirror didn't smile, but it didn't flinch either. That night, Silas returned with a torn coat and a scraped arm he'd slipped near the creek bed. Miriam's instincts overtook hesitation. She ushered him into the back, boiled water, cleaned the wound. Her fingers worked steadily, not out of obligation, but care. Real human care. You don't have to fuss, he murmured. I know, she said, voice soft but certain. But I want to. He looked up then. Their eyes met in the flicker of the oil lamp. His were quiet, steady. You're different than when you first came, he said. Stronger. I think I'm remembering who I used to be, she answered, surprising even herself. He smiled faintly, then leaned back. Then I'll be careful not to get in your way. She chuckled at that, and for the first time in years it wasn't a laugh laced with apology. The next morning she opened the shop before Silas even stirred, brewed the tea, fed the cat, stacked the dried herbs in labeled jars. When he came out, he found her already tending to a customer, a woman with a sick child. Miriam handed the woman a packet and said gently, steep this with honey twice a day. And be kind to yourself. Children need well mothers too. The woman nodded, eyes grateful. Silas stood in the doorway, watching, saying nothing. But when the door closed and the woman had gone, he looked at Miriam and said, You're more healer than I ever was. She shook her head, flustered. I'm only helping. No, he said. You're belonging. When belonging knocks, the heart often hesitates. Can Miriam let herself receive what she's never been given? Without fear, it'll be taken away. Belonging, when it finally comes, doesn't shout. It sets a place at the table quietly and waits to see if you'll sit. Miriam had spent most of her life feeding others and eating last, figuratively and literally. So when Silas pulled out the second chair one morning and said, sit, Eat with me something in her hesitated, not because she didn't want to, but because the invitation touched something so deep it ached. Don't fuss, he said, gesturing to the food. It's just eggs and bread. It's not the food, she answered, lowering herself slowly into the seat. It's being invited. He looked at her, then his quiet gaze lingering. You've always been invited, Miriam. You just never had anyone who meant it. They ate in silence, a comfortable one. That afternoon, Silas took her up to the ridge behind the apothecary, a hill with dry wildflowers and a view over the far valley. It was where he came to think, to breathe. I used to come here with Caroline, he said softly. My wife, before she passed. Miriam stiffened. I can leave you to it. No, he interrupted. I want you to see this place too. She stayed. She looked. The mountains stretched wide and blue. The wind lifted her curls gently. It felt sacred. Did you love her very much? She asked quietly. He nodded. I did. And I think she would have liked you. That caught her breath. I'm not here to replace anyone, Miriam whispered. No one ever could, Silas said. But this world's big enough for more than one kind of love. That night as a storm rolled over the valley, Miriam lay awake in the cot behind the shop. The rain tapped soft against the windows, and for the first time she wasn't anxious about earning her place. She wasn't fretting over being useful enough to stay. She just listened. A crack of thunder startled her, and a childhood memory rose, being told to sleep outside the room because she coughed too much and ruined the mood. Silas knocked gently on the doorframe. You all right? She nodded, pulling the blanket up. Just thinking. He waited a beat. If it helps, you don't have to earn the roof over your head, or the quiet, or the tea in the morning. I'm not used to things just being given, she admitted. He smiled sadly. That's not your fault. The next day a letter came. It was from the town council. They were closing down the apothecary. Regulations, licenses, politics. Miriam read the letter aloud, voice trembling. Silas looked down at his hands. I knew this was coming. They've been trying to push me out. She stood still, and then for the first time raised her chin. Then we won't go quietly. Silas blinked. What do you mean, I mean? She said we fight for the place we've built, and for the people who come to us. She handed him the letter back. You healed me, Silas. Maybe now it's time I help heal you. When roots finally start to grow, the storm tests their strength. Can Miriam and Silas stand firm together when everything they built's under threat? Some battles are fought not with fists but with quiet courage, and letters written in a trembling but steady hand. Miriam hadn't expected to lead a fight. Most of her life she'd been told to stay out of the way. But something had changed the day she saw Silas staring at that letter, shoulders heavy, not from age but from weariness. She recognized that weight. She had worn it too long herself. You can't do this alone, she told him. Silas looked at her. I'm not asking you to. No, she replied. You didn't have to. You didn't. They started small, just a letter to the town council, hand-delivered by Miriam herself. The walk to the courthouse was long, and the glances thrown her way familiar. Some remembered her as the sick one, others as the mail-order bride who never married. But she kept walking. Inside, she handed the letter to the clerk and said simply, We won't be closing. The woman blinked. That's not your decision, ma'am. No, Miriam replied, but it is our community's. Word spread fast. People who'd once come quietly to Silas's apothecary began to speak up. A mother whose baby's fever was broken by Silas's tinctures. A widow whose joint pain had eased after Miriam's gentle poultices. A stable boy who could breathe better after Miriam found him herbs his father couldn't afford. They came to the courthouse, not in crowds but in a steady trickle of stories. Silas stood in the back, arms folded. You did this, he whispered to Miriam. No, she said. We did. That night, sitting on the steps of the apothecary, Silas turned to her. They won't overturn it outright, he said. But they might delay the closure. Maybe long enough. Long enough for what she asked. For people to see this place for what it is, he replied. A kind of home. She rested her head against the doorframe. That's all I ever wanted to be part of. He reached for her hand, not boldly but gently, as if seeking permission. And when she didn't pull away, he let his fingers stay. The next morning, the apothecary bell jingled. An old man shuffled in wheezing. Silas turned to prepare the tonic, but Miriam stopped him. "Let me try this time." Silas watched her mix herbs with practiced care. She spoke gently to the man, made him tea, rubbed his knotted hands. The man left lighter than he came. Silas smiled. "You were meant for this, Miriam." She looked at him, worn gray at the temples, eyes warm, and she didn't flinch. "Maybe I was meant for you too," she said. He paused. "You're not just what I needed. You're what I never thought I deserved." And for the first time, Miriam let herself believe it. As the town decides the fate of the apothecary, Miriam and Silas must face one last reckoning with their past, with their future, and with love that has asked for nothing but given everything. The day of the hearing came with no thunder, no drama, just wind rattling the shutters, and a silence that sat heavy over the town, like a prayer waiting to be answered. Miriam stood beside Silas in the town hall, not hidden behind him, but at his side, her shoulders back, her gray-streaked hair pinned with care, her hands trembling only slightly. The same hands once too weak to carry a teacup now carried testimony. "I wasn't supposed to live long," she said, her voice gentle but steady. "And even if I did, I was told I'd be no use to anyone. But Silas didn't see me that way. He didn't ask for strength. I think he just needed someone who would stay." Silas didn't speak for a long moment. Then they said I was too far gone to start over. But Miriam came and reminded me that healing isn't only found in bottles and powders. Sometimes it walks in on tired feet with nothing to prove and everything to give. There were no grand speeches after that, just a slow nod from the mayor and a few murmurs of agreement. "We'll revisit the closure order," the clerk said. "But for now, the apothecary stays." Later that week, Silas built a new shelf. It wasn't for medicine this time, but for her. For Miriam's dried flowers, her herb journals, her favorite tea tin. She had quietly become part of every corner in that shop, not because she asked to, but because she belonged. In the evenings, they sat out back on the porch, sharing warm cider in worn cups. They didn't talk much. Sometimes they just watched the sky turn from blue to gold, and back again, letting the peace sink in. One morning, Silas asked her very simply, "Would you stay with me?" For good, Miriam didn't cry. She only smiled small and sure. "I already have." Years passed, as years do. The apothecary remained humble, weathered, and full of quiet life. People still came, not just for cures, but for comfort, and always they found it in the careful hand that prepared their herbs, in the warm voice that asked how they'd been in the presence of two people who had once been discarded, but found each other anyway. They were never young lovers, never flashy, but they were steady and they were kind. And in a world that too often forgets those who age and ache quietly, their love whispered, "You are not too late. You are not too much. You are not beyond healing." In a world that told her she was too much, too big, too slow, too unlovable, she held on to her dignity like a lantern in the dark. And somehow in the quiet she was seen. Not as a burden, not as a mistake, but as a woman worthy of a home of touch, of morning coffee shared in silence, and laughter that came not from mockery, but from joy. This story isn't just about a bride once rejected. It's about the quiet courage it takes to keep hoping when the world turns cold, and the miracle of being chosen genuinely gently by someone who doesn't want to change you, but simply stay beside you. Perhaps that's what love looks like later in life. Not fireworks, not fanfare. Just someone who waits while you catch your breath and says, "Take your time. I'm not going anywhere." If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever felt like the world overlooked your worth, only to be reminded you still matter? Leave us a comment below. And if you'd like to hear more tales like this, stories that heal, stories that see the unseen, please consider subscribing to None. Wild West Saga, sharing this video with a friend and giving it a gentle like. Because everyone deserves to feel like they belong. No matter their shape, age, or past, we're glad you're here, and we hope you'll stay.